Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry to keep you from your coffee break. I also apologize for the late delivery of this paper, but I hopefully will be able to walk you through it even if you haven't been able to read it in advance. So my question has to do with the relationship between the law and institutions, particularly at the international level of human rights, and the question of social exclusion and inclusion and participation that we are occupied with in these days. In an era in which global norms and institutions and processes of human rights law have only recently begun to turn their attention to the challenge of social exclusion, what role can we reasonably expect those systems, especially at these international levels, as I said, to play in bringing about a more comprehensively inclusive and participatory society? How does the concept of social exclusion relate to the idea of human rights? And what does a human rights approach to social exclusion have to offer us? What are the possibilities and limitations of supranational human rights mechanisms in addressing and providing remedies to the problems of social exclusion? In this paper, I argue that we should not invest high expectations in the capacities of international human rights systems to bring about dramatic social transformations in the direction of inclusive participatory societies. This is because of certain inherent conceptual and structural limitations in the apparatus of human rights protection, which makes it largely inapt for the goals we're aiming to achieve. Nevertheless, I do want to emphasize that human rights mechanisms do have an important, even if ultimately limited, part to play in overcoming widespread social exclusion. Now, the idea of an attention to the problem of social exclusion, although, as we've heard, has been present in the social science literature since at least the early 1970s, has only much more recently begun to make its way into the discourse and practice of human rights law on the world stage. Whereas some constitutional systems have a longer history of it, India, for example, we see the concept of social exclusion being introduced into the Council of Europe system only in 1996, but a reference that then receives no substantive attention for a decade and a half after that. In the inter-American human rights system, discussions of social exclusion and inclusion began to be heard about a decade ago, and similarly have acquired much more momentum only in the last 5 years. But today there is an active discussion of the issue in human rights scholarly and practice circles, especially in the Americas. This heightened interest and attention to the problem of social exclusion in this current historical period has many causes which are being explored throughout our discussions in this plenary. I won't repeat them where others have elaborated them in much more detail. I will only mention that there are some additional reasons specific to the political and legal developments in the hemisphere of the Americas, especially in Latin America, that are worth noting and cast a distinctive kind of accent on the engagement of the issue. Developments in particular related to new trends in Latin American constitutionalism in places such as Bolivia and Ecuador, and new ideological dynamics related to democracy in places such as Venezuela. First puzzle that we encounter in trying to tease out this relationship between human rights and social exclusion is a conceptual one, how to properly frame what their relationship is. Certainly, at least in the juridical literature, there is a great lack of clarity. Social exclusion is often defined in terms of rights directly, but it's far from clear in the law and legal sciences whether social exclusion is better understood as an outcome in which certain social sectors are denied their human rights, or whether instead human rights violations should be seen as the causes of social exclusion. As used by René Lenoir in Les Exclus, which was referred to by Professor Porpora in the previous talk, the term social exclusion was initially defined as the mechanisms through which persons and groups were denied participation and social rights. The absence of rights was therefore understood as the outcome of a process of exclusion. More recently, scholars such as Maurice Aubert continue to describe social exclusion in just this way, as a process which ultimately results in a denial of human rights. Now, if this is the case, then we might regard the respect for human rights as something of an indicator of levels of inclusion and exclusion. And in seeking to remedy the problem in that case, we would therefore logically not so much fight social exclusion through the juridical guarantees of human rights as the opposite, seek to attain higher levels of realization of human rights by addressing the root causes of exclusion in the social and economic, political, cultural spheres. On the other hand, in the human rights literature, the terms frequently are lexically ordered in exactly the opposite way. Patterns of human rights violations, such as systemic discrimination that prevents individuals and communities from securing work and education, participating in social life, in political life, or accessing social benefits, are understood to cause or substantially contribute to a multidimensional phenomenon not defined in terms of rights violations, but rather including such features as entrenched poverty, stigmatization, social rejection, a breakdown of social ties and bonds, disempowerment, social conflict. A third possibility altogether is simply to see social inclusion as itself a human right, and social exclusion as its violation. This approach is in some ways analogous to debates within fundamental rights discourse about human dignity, while in most constitutional and international documents and jurisprudence, dignity is understood as the foundation or source of rights, the basis on which to assert rights. In a few of them, for example, in German constitutional law or the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the right to dignity is recognized directly. So which of these approaches makes the most helpful sense of the phenomenon of social exclusion and the role of human rights in it? Let's begin with the last option. Expressing social inclusion as itself the right at issue seems too broad and amorphous to be useful. It leads to problems much like those notoriously plaguing the right to development in international law for several decades. Aggregating under that single right what are in fact a host of interrelated but nevertheless discrete problems effectively serves to obscure more than to illuminate the problem as a whole. While there may be rhetorical and aspirational value in affirming a human right to development, 40 years of legal experience have shown us that it is not a very useful construct because we are hard-pressed to identify the content of the right in practical terms, or the holders of whatever duties are correlative to the right. In important ways, the value of using the language of human rights at all is in large part because it helps us disaggregate larger notions like dignity, common good, and development into more specific relationships of justice, where the right holder and the duty bearer can be more easily identified and held to account. At a juridical level, at least, reaggregating rights into larger concepts thus serves to deprive them of much of their force and utility. This is no less true of social exclusion or inclusion. Expressed as a right in itself, it is so difficult to specify that we are hard-pressed to articulate what exactly it requires and of whom it would required, who exactly is doing the excluding. Turning then to the question of lexical priority between rights and exclusion instead, two reasons favor the approach that sees violations of rights as contributing to a broader and multidimensional phenomenon of exclusion that is itself not defined merely in terms of rights. The first one is of logic. If social exclusion equals exclusion from human rights, and conversely, realization of human rights is elimination of social exclusion, then the addition of social exclusion to the concept of human rights is entirely self-referential and circular. It adds nothing to our analysis. But second, and more importantly, As we can see from so many of the rich contributions to these plenary discussions, social exclusion as a human reality has many facets that are in complex interrelationship, and not easily reducible to the relatively wooden and artificial language of rights. Psychosocial elements such as shame and humiliation and loss of a sense of self-worth, the breakdown of relationships at all levels, from families to neighborhoods to broader associations of civic life, barriers of communication and language, and so on. It is instead easier to capture reasonably, in the sense of accounting for the totality of its factors, the reality of the phenomenon of social exclusion if we recognize that human rights violations can frequently trigger, exacerbate, and perpetuate the conditions of exclusion, but do not in themselves explain exhaustively the dimensions of the problem. These reflections on the conceptual relationship between human rights and social exclusion are not merely formalities. The divergences are reflected in the existing attempts to address social exclusion through the positive law and practice of human rights institutions with differing tangible effects. In the next section, I largely describe and summarize the positive law and practice of human rights in the two systems where the idea of social exclusion has become recently prominent, in the Council of Europe system and in the inter-American system of human rights. In the interest of time, I won't read this section in great detail, but we see that on the one hand, in the Council of Europe system, the revised European Social Charter of 1996 includes an explicit reference to social exclusion in its Article 30, which has been interpreted and applied in a variety of cases by the Committee on Social Rights. And what we see in them is essentially a requirement that states that social exclusion is largely translated into a requirement that states take an affirmative and coordinated approach to various social issues. In particular, the question of adequacy of housing frequently comes up, rather than an ad hoc or case-by-case one. Now, that's not a bad thing. It does imply a recognition that social exclusion, having systemic aspects, requires a systemic approach. But it does not discernibly help enhance participation and agency in society by those who are, in fact, socially excluded. Based on the limited European experience of the application of the question, then, it would be hard to conclude that adding the concept of social exclusion to human rights systems, or bringing a human rights approach to the problem of social exclusion in general, has provided much useful analytical or remedial tools. The inter-American system has fared considerably better in this, I believe, and I describe some of the cases in which social exclusion, while not labeled as such, has clearly been an animating motivation and concept to address problems such as the abandonment of street children, the exclusion of ethnic minorities from political participation, or violence against women in places like Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. And most relevantly, in a whole series of cases involving the property rights of indigenous peoples, which then flow into problems of widespread malnutrition, lack of education, poor health, harm to their religious beliefs and spiritual practices, and the loss of cultural memory and integrity. In these sorts of cases, which I refer to as the social exclusion cases, the inter-American system has taken aim at forms of social exclusion considerably more comprehensively and relevantly than the European institutions have. And note first that it's not by creating a right to protection from social exclusion, nor simply by conflating social exclusion with the violation of rights per se. Both of these problems plague the European approach. Rather, the Inter-American Court has in each case considered the way that patterns of human rights violations are part of a much broader, multidimensional, and structural problem of vulnerability and marginalization. While not themselves exhaustive of the problem of social exclusion per se, these patterns of violations are understood by the court as helping to produce and reinforce the problem in broader ways, and this in turn leads the court to draw up multifaceted remedies. I'll just say in passing, the Inter-American Court and the Inter-American system is in general known for having very creative and assertive uses of its remedial authority, compensating victims not only in pecuniary terms like the European Court of Human Rights does, but also ordering a variety of moral and symbolic actions and various guarantees of non-repetition, training programs for authorities to criminal prosecutions of violators, in particular to major legal and constitutional reforms designed to address such broad social problems. The court has made full use of these remedies in the social exclusion cases I describe, going far beyond direct compensation of immediate victims and ordering the creation and alteration of significant social programs. For example, the establishment of trust funds for the education of children from the affected communities. Now, precisely in these inter-American cases, we can see both the promise and the perils or limitations of seeking to use international mechanisms of human rights protection to tackle social exclusion in a comprehensive way. On the one hand, they help to illustrate exactly the common core of principles at stake, flowing from a recognition of the universality of human dignity, principles of the moral equality of all human beings, of the demands of justice, of the protection of various forms of participation in society, such as the rights to vote, to work, to be educated, or to believe and worship. All of these help to specify the content of the common good, and therefore to give useful detail to what we should be seeking, at least in part, when we seek to realize participation and inclusion in our societies. Respect for human rights is not coterminous with social inclusion in these cases, but is an essential aspect of building genuinely inclusive and participatory societies. On the other hand, it is important to note that the more aggressive and creative inter-American approach to the challenge of social exclusion through human rights is in many ways problematic as well. For one thing, we must acknowledge honestly the fact of the relatively limited practical impact of the Inter-American Court's remedial interventions. In general, the states party to the disputes have paid the reparations due to the immediate victims, often provided measures of symbolic and moral reparations, such as public apologies, but by far the most difficult measures of reparation have been those seeking to ensure the non-repetition of such violations, exactly those remedial measures most centrally related to the impact that the violations have on more general systemic problems of social exclusion. When the guarantees of non-repetition involve training programs or the sensitization of civil servants or police forces, they are as commonly complied with as they are seemingly ineffective at producing real change. The much harder and rarer steps to take are those requiring substantial legal and constitutional reforms. By the court's own assessment in its ongoing supervision of compliance with its judgments, these are rarely implemented. Even in the few cases where there has been some partial implementation of the states, of the structural legal reforms envisaged by the court, the ongoing prevalence of the underlying social problems, such as violence against women in Ciudad Juarez or the detention of migrants throughout Central America, would suggest that the court's remedial prescriptions have not had a significant ameliorative effect. We might suppose that it's just a question of giving them more time, perhaps, but even in the few cases where there have been more substantial levels of state compliance with requirements of legal reform, dating back as far as 2001, there still is a lack of evidence of deep change. For example, in the case, landmark case of the Awastigni indigenous community in Nicaragua, even though the Nicaraguan state did, after more than a decade, provide the indigenous community with collective title to a portion of their ancestral lands, as the Inter-American Court had ordered, severe social conflicts over the protection of those lands persists unabated today. This brings us directly to the limitations of international human rights mechanisms to address the problem of social exclusion or to bring about substantially higher degrees of inclusion and participation in society. even when the conceptual relationship between the two is reasonably oriented, and even when the institutions of law do attempt to take very seriously the role that human rights violations play in sustaining the conditions of social exclusion, still we see the outcomes to be limited in their scope and tangible impact. Now, to some degree, we've run up against the limits of law in general in bringing about social change, but I would like to go beyond that baseline problem and suggest some structural reasons why international human rights norms and processes and institutions are even more hampered beyond the limitations of law in general in their capacity to bring about major changes in this area. I will briefly mention 4 of them. The first begins from the self-evident observation that social exclusion is a complex and deeply rooted and multidimensional phenomenon. Now, this may seem to be banal, but I'm not aiming to make a point about the phenomenon of social exclusion so much as a point about the language and practice of human rights, especially in its supranational instantiation. Precisely what has made human rights a politically and juridically powerful practice is its ability to take problems of justice writ large and to situate them in an analytically more manageable triadic form, where there is a right holder or claimant on the one hand, a duty bearer, often but not always the state, on the other, and a specific norm of justice applicable between them. This allows us to focus on the value of each person, or sometimes group, as a bearer of rights, to make specific demands of what is owed to the claimant by the duty holder, while at the same time abstracting to a high degree from the particularities of the claimant's history, social status, environment, culture, and so forth. The universality in theory and the effectiveness in practice of human rights claims, especially in the transnational context, relies heavily on this dynamic. It is what allows us to say with sufficient clarity and categorical force, for instance, that no one shall be subject to slavery or torture. Yet these same characteristics, which give the language of human rights their rhetorical and political potency, make the apparatus of human rights less well suited to articulating the demands of justice where the social problems are highly diffuse, or where the demands of justice are less susceptible of being framed in the triadic form of claimant, norm, and duty bearer, as is the case in addressing the problem of social exclusion. Second, but related to the first reason, is the difficulty of moving from specific human rights violations to general conditions of the right or the good and vice versa. The problem is analogous to the thorny divide existing today between our growing knowledge of the dynamics of economic development at micro levels and our need to address development at the macroeconomic levels if we are to succeed in having a significant impact on global poverty. Even when we are able to identify that a specific development intervention has a positive outcome on the well-being of its specific beneficiaries, we often know strikingly little about the same intervention when scaled, about how the same intervention when scaled would affect the general equilibrium conditions of the economies in which they are situated. So it is also with human rights focus on remedies for individual violations. Internationalizing access to justice by individuals has been one of the most powerful and transformative developments in international law of the last 75 years. But that same dynamic does not obviously yield generalizable solutions to the, by analogy, general equilibrium conditions of social inclusion and exclusion. Moving between these levels is highly uncertain and debatable. The third challenge is one of institutional competence and legitimacy. Even in the best of domestic circumstances, judges and courts are not particularly well suited to untangling complex, multidimensional problems using various disciplinary perspectives, as we are trying to do here. They frequently lack the expertise to analyze the situation adequately, to judge its causes and dimensions, and to be able to act on it appropriately. Transposing that to an international plane magnifies the problem even more, because it becomes not only a question of relevant competence in the sense of substantive expertise, not merely formal legal competence, but also of social and political legitimacy. International institutions are deliberately removed from direct accountability to individual states, and even more from their populace. Designed to provide external checks on the possible abuses of nation states, they displace local political life in favor of external, elite, and putatively expert decision makers. It becomes paradoxical then to rely on them to enhance authentic participation in the local political, economic, and social environments. They're frequently perceived, in fact, as precisely designed to depoliticize those environments and to remove from the local context the power to make collective decisions over certain basic rules of social life. In the interest of time, I'll skip to the fourth and final point. It is a more contingent but no powerful objection, which comes from the particular features of international human rights discourse in the contemporary era. Now, the critique of rights talk and the kind of society that it generates is not new, but today various versions of that critique come from many different sides. Especially in the secular, liberal, and North Atlantic form that has a fairly hegemonic grip on international human rights orthodoxy today, the practice of human rights tends strongly toward extreme forms of individualism and finds the relational goods that are at the center of our discussions here very difficult to account for. So, for instance, even though the family is provided for as the fundamental group unit of society in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in contemporary human rights practice, the family appears almost exclusively as a locus of domination and suppression of individual autonomy, never as a place of education toward participation, inclusion, and personal flourishing. And yet, contrary to that individualistic paradigm, as we see in our discussions here, at the heart of the challenge of inclusion and participation is in fact the structural human need for relationship and belonging. Now, I refer to in a certain sense, a laundry list of problematic features of rights talk altogether as contingent because, unlike some anti-liberal rights skeptics, I do not find rights necessarily to be dominated by an ethic of individual autonomy. But today it undoubtedly is so, and it's telling that even Pope Francis has made this aspect of rights talk central to his many exhortations to make our societies more welcoming and inclusive, making him, in a certain sense, surprisingly, probably the fiercest papal critic of rights talk since the 19th century. And the long quotations that I have on page 12 are just a few of the examples of the forms of criticism where he favors approaches to questions of inclusion through the language and concepts of responsibility, solidarity, and fraternity, rather than through the language and concepts of rights. So in conclusion, does all of this mean that human rights, particularly as embodied and practiced through international norms, processes, and institutions, are not helpful to advance our goal of a more inclusive and participatory society? I do not mean to say that at all. For the reasons mentioned earlier, they can be important and useful instruments, provided, however, that we understand their role to be limited. Thus, human rights mechanisms can identify and help remove specific barriers to participation, specifically, in particular, those in our previous discussion that were related to fundamental problems of equality. For example, a prohibition on new political parties aimed at bringing more voters into the democratic processes. These are examples that I draw from real cases. Or on public expressions of religious pluralism in society. They can address some of the more systemic forms of discrimination, such as the legal incapacity of women to provide testimony in court, or to own property, or to exercise certain professions. But beyond this admittedly hard to define core of concerns with direct and overt kinds of exclusion and discrimination, human rights are perhaps best directed not to the utopian project of transforming society, but instead to the more modest and realistic one of maintaining the conditions of openness within which persons and groups can have the conditions to exercise their moral agency, room to develop new social initiatives generative of a greater inclusion, and the space to dedicate themselves to the good of one another in community. Human rights mechanisms can, in other words, serve the aim of social inclusion by protecting the dimensions of freedom, the freedom to speak, to organize, to educate, to worship, that permit new forms of solidarity and responsibility to arise from the bottom up. Or again, as Pope Francis put it, the spaces and freedoms that allow people to become the artisans of their own destiny. The mechanisms of human rights cannot make the seedlings of participation and inclusion germinate, but they can nourish the soil in which they sprout and protect them from being trampled so that they have the opportunity to grow strong and to flourish. Thank you.